Thank you all very much for being back here again after lunch. I know that half the benefit of a forum like this is the discussion that goes on during the lunch and coffee breaks. But we have lots of important presentations to listen to this afternoon, so let's get the sessions underway. Just by way of introduction, my name is Kirby Eichen. I guess I'm here wearing a couple of different hats. I'm Managing Director of Asia Pacific Aerospace Consultants, but I thought I would mention a couple of other affiliations given the presentation that Matthew made just before lunch. I'm also the Chairman of the Board of Directors of the National Space Society, which is based in Washington, DC. And I'm the first non-American to chair that organisation, having taken over from Buzz Aldrin. And it had its roots in the L5 Society that was mentioned in the previous presentation. I'm also here with Deep Space Industries. I'm one of the founders, along with Mark Sonter, another Australian who's sitting in the audience. And we were introduced to Deep Space Industries by Rick Tumlinson, who you were hearing about back in the previous presentation. I mentioned some of those things because this session is about international perspectives. And I think a lot of people sometimes wonder what the role is for Australians in this newly emerging space industry. But here we have the Off-Earth Mining Forum, started in Sydney and having its third iteration several years later here in Sydney with a world gathering taking place. We heard Kyle from iSpace earlier referring to the fact that he would love to see some of the PhD students from here participating in those future programs. And I think that the world has changed in such a way that it is now a truly global endeavour when we look at things like off-Earth mining. So I ask you to keep that in mind as we listen to these fascinating panel of speakers that we have coming up. First up is Michael Simpson, who is the Executive Director of the Secure World Foundation and Vice Chair of the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group. I'm also very pleased to be able to say that he's a member of the Board of Governors of the National Space Society, so delighted to see NSS having another face at this forum. Michael.
Okay, looks like that works. So, do I have a clicker here that can work this? So I'm here to talk to you about a group called the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group. It's a group that really emerged out of a conference called by the Hague Institute for Global Justice, a not-for-profit organization incorporated in the capital of the Netherlands, and which became interested in the possibility that we could take the multiple perspectives, policy perspectives and legal perspectives on space mining, bring together a cross-section of people with those ideas, and create some what eventually became known as building blocks that policymakers could look at as they begin to address the challenges that space mining will present. It was sort of a quixotic idea. It was an idea that out of what appeared to be intellectual conflict, we might be able to build consensus. As we'll see as we go along, we seem to have made at least enough progress to say that the goal of this group, which was to have an enabling environment for space mining, seems to be within reach. And we'll see what some of the progress has been. Just taking a look here, first of all, at the first slide. This gives you an idea of what emerged from that Hague meeting, that first meeting in December of 2014. And it began to give people a sense that there were far more conversation opportunities that should be pursued. So out of the roundtable comes this sense of a commitment to multi-stakeholder participation. Let's get lots of people to the table, developing countries, underdeveloped countries, fully developed spacefaring countries. Can we get to the table people who really are fond of the Moon Agreement? Yeah, there are a few. And people who are perhaps more inclined to see the Outer Space Treaty as a basis for negotiation, and then those that would like to scrap the whole thing and simply get on with it. We put together a pretty good cross-section of such people and started to focus, as I mentioned, on this idea of building blocks. So the working group had its first meeting in 2016. That meeting, it clarified that it was at best what's known as a track 1.5 process, diplomatic speak for a group that has government representatives and non-government representatives looking at political problems but without the authority to resolve them. The advantage of that is you talk freely, you come up with sometimes crazy ideas that evolve into sometimes pretty solid ideas, sometimes ideas that can be clarified by a large number of people providing feedback. We had 25 members, 42 observers. The chairperson was René Lefebvre, a Dutch diplomat, who did a pretty brilliant job of integrating both members and observers into a thorough discussion. Essentially, the only difference between a member and an observer was that if it came down to some kind of vote being necessary, the members were the ones who voted. I do not remember a single case where that happened. Pretty much everything that is in the document that I'll refer to here in just a little bit emerged by a particular kind of consensus. It was a consensus not that people agreed with everything in the document, but that they agreed the time had come to share this document for public comment. Because what we would love to do is to refine the document to one that can be useful to decision makers eventually. All the interventions, that is all the comments, all the speeches, all the statements of opinion were considered personal, even though everybody really had some sort of organizational affiliation. We never considered them to be speaking for their organization. Some people felt a little freer to speak on their own than others, but for the most part, we got a lot of creative input without binding the organizations that people came from. So what were the aspirations of this working group? We, first of all, wanted to create an enabling environment for space resources. And I emphasize this because it's been a surprise to some people that this was a goal. There was a sense that maybe this was more interested in finding a way to restrict the industry. And keep in mind that this goal emerged even though there were several people at the table who either had written academic papers in support of the Moon Agreement or were from countries that were signatories, in most cases ratified signatories, of the Moon Agreement. They still agreed to this statement. And what that means, what that agreement means, we still have a lot of work to do. But the fact that they were willing to agree is probably best explained by the idea that took root very early in the first session, that the Outer Space Treaty says that space should be for the benefit of all humankind. Well, they said mankind, but let's update. Benefit of all humankind. And there is no possible way to achieve benefit without development. If we don't develop, there will be no benefit. And so there may be some discussions ahead about what benefit means, but even there was a lot of flexibility. And the first lesson I'd like you to take away from my presentation is that as you develop business plans or business concepts or ideas about space resources activity, and you can articulate ways that it will benefit more than just the investors, you have a tremendous asset on your hands. Because just as we can say of the satellite broadcast industry, that it's been critical to economic development in many underdeveloped parts of the world, even though they're not sharing in the dividends, they're sharing in the service. so too I think we're going to be able to discover that kind of impact out of space mining. And of course, one that has already been discussed is space mining is mining in hostile environments. And some of the greatest expertise in mining in hostile environments in the world are in underdeveloped countries. So simply hiring some of that expertise starts to extend the benefit. We wanted to create these building blocks, which basically were ideas that could be used by decision makers. And we were very, very much in agreement on this concept of incrementalism and adaptive governance. Adaptive governance. Adaptive governance is the very wise notion that we often develop legislation and rules for activities after we have some experience with the activity. Frontier countries often sent settlers forward first and the law came second. After the settlers said, well, we wanted to be free, but we also don't want our neighbor to be quite as free as our neighbor has proved to be recently. So adaptive governance is one of the concepts I think that will help decision makers in particular understand that as we develop space mineral resource opportunities, we will learn the things that need to be regulated, and if we are reasonably wise, the things that don't need to be regulated, rather than trying to guess in advance and create a system that would solve problems we haven't even encountered yet. Complementarity of effort simply was an idea that would be able to bring a kind of synergy out of the action of states, the action of entrepreneurs, the action of multilateral and international institutions, so that we weren't all pushing in opposite directions. Solicitation of reaction and feedback was an initial goal. It took us a while to get something we thought was ready for feedback, but that is now published, and I'll show you a bit.ly link here that you can actually go to when you have a little free time to take a look at the building blocks document. It's a draft, but it is open for comment until next July 1st, because we're eager to make sure that it has a long enough period for good ideas to have sufficient gestation. And we wanted to provide a resource base for decision makers. Again, we are not the decision maker, but we want to do the staff work that the decision maker will ultimately be able to use. So our output, we initially published 18 building block concepts on our website. It's a website hosted for us by the University of Leiden Institute of Air and Space Law. That got us some feedback, but people were sort of waiting to see what the meat might be on the bones. As of our last meeting, literally just a little over a week ago, we have gotten agreement to open a draft of the entire thinking right now relative to building blocks, for people to let us know what they think. What did we miss? What did we get right? What looks like we should have our brains in a glass jar at the university? Whatever it might be, that feedback is important, and we will hopefully get a chance to use that pretty soon. Keep in mind that the working group is not publishing this document with the idea that everybody agrees to every line of it. We're just not there yet. But we did agree that the time has come to get other smart people looking at the idea. The process is one that is designed to involve people who are dealing operationally with space resources, the people are dealing politically, folks that are trying to struggle with the law that might apply, and they're just a parenthetical. When you think of the challenge of space law as it relates to the law of space resources activity off Earth, keep in mind that everything you have ever heard about space law is the opinion of a smart person, because we have never had a case. When I taught law, I cannot imagine teaching international law to students without giving them cases. We have not had a case. And so it's simply because no one has ever brought a case under space law to any court where the parties to that case were willing to accept the jurisdiction. So we are struggling to define things by understanding rather than by precedent. And so if you think things are confusing, well, that's okay. If you are aware of international law, you know there are lots of sources. The source we get to use in international space law is known as a subsidiary source, and it's the opinion of well-qualified publicists. We have 5 treaties, but they've never been tested in a court of law. Well, that is bad news, up to a point. It also is good news, because it means that every conflict that's been resolved between countries in space has been resolved without having to go to court. And that is a speciality of our space activity, that we seem to be able to find solutions, because we seem to also believe that we need solutions in order to succeed. So what are the next steps? Phase 2 of the working group has been agreed to. It'll begin its work next spring. It will actually have a first session that might feel an awful lot like this forum, in that it intends to really focus on briefing the entire working group on some of the technical issues as they're emerging, some of the operational issues. That is, understand the nature and state of the business and the possibilities before we go any further. And then it will have a meeting in the fall next year, at which the feedback that will have been received by July would have been compiled, available for pre-study, and then discussed with the hope of incorporating the best suggestions into future documents. So your next steps. Well, we would certainly like, in the first bullet at the end, reduce so it might be easier for you to jot down in your notes, is a bit.ly link. That link goes to the University of Leiden, the page that deals with the building blocks. There's a general description of the building blocks, and on the bottom of that page, there's a place you can click to get the draft building blocks. That is the document we would love for you to think about often, and send feedback to the Secretariat of the working group. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We're not serial tweeters, so it's not like your system will light up with huge numbers of posts. There have been a few posts from this session. Facebook, our address is there, and Twitter, our address is also posted. This is particularly useful because from time to time, links to documents that you might find helpful in your own work and thinking are posted. And the address for feedback is spaceresources@law.leidenuniversity.nl for Netherlands. So that leaves us with some time for questions. Comment on the concept of looking at issues that might eventually generate enabling consensus, or any other feedback you may wish to offer. And there are members of the group also in the audience who should feel free to pop up. Yep, Jerry.
Just more out of curiosity than anything, but has there been any comparison done with any proposals for laws relating to undersea mining?
Yeah, we have looked at the UNCLO, this UN Conference on the Law of the Sea, and and the fact that there is a seabed authority, and a number of those ideas have been shared. There's certainly a number of members who are reluctant to see that much bureaucracy in the early stages of space resources, unlike the seabed, where we have confirmed, mostly through government expense, that there are very interesting materials available to be harvested. We're still at a much earlier stage in the area of space mineral resources, and so there has been some sense to say that the Law of the Sea Convention emerged out of actually several thousand years of using the ocean, and it might be worth at least waiting several decades before we get that detailed with what we do. And it to some extent avoids an argument that I thought would have been a crippling argument for the working group, and has proved not to be, and that's the argument between those who support the Moon Agreement's concept of space as the common heritage of humankind, and those who are more inclined to look at the exploration and use of space being the province of humankind, which is the Outer Space Treaty language, keeping in mind that exploration and use has as much prominence in that sentence as does province of all humankind. So we've managed to avoid that being a crippling obstacle, and to focus more on what do we do to extend benefit to the largest number of people as being a pathway to possible consensus. Yes?
I think we've kind of run out of time.
Okay, sorry.
So let's all thank Michael for... Thank you, Michael. That's one of the problems. There's so much interesting information to be imparted in these sessions, and with 20 minutes, you can only start to scratch the surface. So I'd like to move on to our second speaker. We're privileged to have Piero Messina from the Strategy Department of the European Space Agency, and I believe he is going to talk a bit about Moon Village